Hi everyone. Today I'm going to do a review of a nonfiction book. I learned about it from Ezra Klein's podcast, and I linked the related episode below. And that podcast was David French's September 2020 appearance as a guest on the show, in which he and the host had an interesting debate about the likelihood of secession of some of the states in the U.S. and how it relates to today's polarized political climate. I found it an interesting conversation, and it left me wanting to go a little bit deeper, which led me to this book. The title of the book, which is written by David French, is Divided We Fall: America's Secession Threat and How to Restore Our Nation. And this book was also released quite recently. I think it was released around the time of the podcast, which would be mid-September 2020. Now, part of what I wanted to go deeper into, especially after listening to French's podcast appearance with Ezra Klein, was how likely are these threats of secession really that he's talking about, and what is the evidence supporting French's case that they're actually fairly likely. So I was a little bit disappointed to find that this book, despite its title and the topic of conversation that led me to it, is not first and foremost a book about secession. It's a book about political polarization and its effects, and how that's led to the modern political divide in the U.S., as well as what might happen a few years or a few decades down the road as a result. Unfortunately, in my opinion, the chapters depicting two possible secession scenarios called Cal-Exit and Texit. You can probably guess what those refer to. Came across to me more as a wild speculation than anything that was really likely possibilities. Sure, I think French makes a compelling argument that these scenarios are possible, but he comes nowhere near convincing me that they're anything beyond mere possibility, and certainly not that they're likely. In fact, I felt these two chapters were somewhat out of place, though necessary to fulfill the promise of the book's title, and for a pretty short book that covered just about 7 hours in the audiobook format, I would have preferred a little bit less of the unsubstantiated detail in, for example, the Texit chapter about how Texit eventually leads to global nuclear proliferation, increased tensions between China, Taiwan, and Japan. I would have preferred a deeper examination and refutation of likely arguments against the probability of secession in spite of polarization, like those that he discussed with Ezra Klein on the podcast, which I don't think are given enough attention in this book. And most of the other chapters don't primarily focus on this topic of secession. They do address political and cultural polarization. They criticize attempts on both sides of the political spectrum, but recently, particularly on the left, to shift the boundaries of what topics even fall within the realm of political and social discourse, often imposing sort of limitations that have been seen as criticizing free speech. And perhaps most importantly, they argue that the best path to preventing further division and even possibly secession is to re-embrace the ideas of federalism and state sovereignty that were laid out towards the country's founding in the Federalist Papers. Maintaining a plurality of ideas and opinions, and even political factions, French argues, is the key to making America a nation where groups with different politics, ideologies, religions, and life philosophies can thrive. It may seem dangerous to let ideas thrive that one personally finds abhorrent, but the alternative path of stifling such ideas or pushing them too quickly to the fringe will inevitably lead to an actually more problematic nation resembling the one we see in George Orwell's 1984. These arguments, and not the likelihood of secession, are what this book is to me really about. So if you'd like to delve deeply into the questions and scenarios of secession, I probably wouldn't recommend this book as your starting point. As for these other topics, David French covers them with various levels of success, all from a somewhat conservative-leaning perspective, but never to an extent that is outright dismissive of either side's values and arguments. It's refreshing to see someone who has clearly at least tried to understand points of view opposing his. In my opinion, he has some success with this, even though he openly admits that as a conservative, he can't do full justice to progressive liberal viewpoints, and this does come across at times in his writing. Of course, though his attempt to balance both sides of the issue is admirable, it sometimes becomes difficult to distinguish his presentations of conservative perceptions from outright presentations of his own opinions, which is not necessarily bad, but it can become confusing and distract from the broader points that I think he'd agree are his real points in writing this book. On the topic of political polarization, I wasn't too familiar with the academic discussion around this area before reading this book, but French presented the topic in a way that makes sense and certainly taught me a bit. Is it one of the best books out there to read if you're interested in learning about this topic? My guess is probably it's not, since there are other books that focus more specifically and exclusively on political polarization without the whole secession spin. It is, however, a reasonable starting point, and as I already mentioned, I think it's admirable that it's written in a way and by a person who isn't tremendously polarizing. I think any book about polarization written from a heavily pro-liberal or a heavily pro-conservative perspective would be bound to miss the actual point. Moving on then to the discussion around political discourse, the meaning of tolerance, and the need for protecting free speech. French points out ways in which free speech has sometimes been effectively limited on the left. For example, with conservatives trying to invite speakers to college campuses and being prevented from doing so, or being silenced in sort of a softer sense, in a sense that certain topics of discussion that conservatives don't see as resolved have effectively been made taboo to discuss in liberal circles in a way that makes conservative people feel that they have no voice. He also admits, though, that to call these attempts purely a tactic of the left would be wrong, pointing out one prominent example of rhetoric by conservatives calling for NFL owners to fire any players that refuse to stand for the national anthem, and claims that any defense of such rhetoric as just giving liberals a taste of their own medicine is mere hypocrisy. I was a little bit more conflicted about this section, because on one hand, I do support free speech in the broader sense that French advocates for, even in some cases when it involves speech that many people find highly objectionable, because I agree with French that it's very difficult to come up with a consistent boundary of what should and shouldn't be considered objectionable, so objectionable that it should be silenced, and I think silencing things that seem like fringe arguments, no matter how much I disagree with them, is a slippery slope and in fact is not actually going to change the minds of anyone being silenced. Still, I suspect that other voices and scholars have recently published more thorough discussions that better encompass the diversity of opinions about this topic of free speech and what constitutes free speech, because this is certainly a hot topic recently. And while I agree with much of what French is claiming, I don't really think his discussion gives due credit to the leading arguments against unbridled free speech. Instead, I think he just presents free speech as something that's under attack and that we need to uphold, and then argues that the limitation of free speech is leading to polarization. And I agree with that, but I just don't think it's that simple, and I don't suspect that this part of the book will really convince people who are skeptical, regardless of what their political affiliation is. French emphatically also argues for a renewal of the nation's early principle of federalism, which in simple terms affirms some level of sovereignty of the individual states comprising the federation that we call the United States. French points out that nowadays national elections have an outsized and winner-takes-all level of importance. The winning party seeks not just to empower and protect their voters and constituents, but to utterly dominate the political system as a whole and to push through as many sweeping laws and reforms as they can, in a way that can only make the losing side feel completely crushed, as everything they fought for previously seems to, and in certain aspects actually does, come crumbling down, all as a result of an election in which somewhere around 50% of the US population disagrees with the results. And then 2 or 4 or 8 years later, when that party loses, we can hardly be surprised that the other party regaining power scrambles to dismantle everything that their opponents have done as fast as they possibly can, because these policies simply aren't, or at least aren't yet, universally supported or even universally tolerated. So French argues that maintaining a pluralism of ideas, which comes from upholding the principles of federalism, is an antidote to the country's current polarization. And what this means in practice is that some states should be allowed to have laws that may be found objectionable in other states. But the value of this that would be gained is that in letting some states set their own policies, and in letting factions be just that, factions, it would prevent everyone in the country from being forced to adhere to the views of the slight majority. And to take that argument just even a bit further, French argues that having factions that are just factions, as opposed to overwhelming bodies that have a legitimate possibility of forcing their views upon a lot of people who don't really agree, is healthier for the country. He even argues that allowing factions to exist that are extremely problematic, maybe expressing highly racist views or views that some religions find highly objectionable, is better in the long run, because letting these factions remain small units and letting people choose by reason not to subscribe to these views is more effective than just simply saying that certain factions can't exist, which, as we've seen a lot recently, is not really a solution, especially in the days of the internet, where people can form controversial and even radical factions with anonymity and ease. On one hand, I agree with this idea. I think that a plurality of ideas is a strength for our country. I think that most problematic ideas should better be countered by rational argument as opposed to by outright suppression, and I do find it problematic to make laws that suppress certain ideas, because I find that a slippery slope, and I also would find it hard to determine which ideas should be suppressed, and I suspect that the ideas being suppressed would often be subject to the whims of the people in power. And then one other advantage to allowing these factions to exist is that if it is an established principle that these factions can exist, you never run the risk that the opposing faction becomes so strong that it completely overpowers your own faction and basically says that your faction is no longer allowed to exist. On the other hand, I did see a few flaws in this argument. One of those flaws, of course, is that in order for this plurality to be allowed, there has to be an agreement among the factions that none of them is going to seek to dominate the other factions. So it doesn't really work if you have 5 factions and 4 of them say they'll let the others exist, but the 5th one says that if they get power, then they're going to eliminate all the other factions by force and abolish elections, for example. So it's definitely unclear to me what principles would need to be enforced to prevent factions or minor political parties or states from being able to break these rules once it's convenient to them. I think it also oversimplifies the problem a little bit because I think that we live in a country where, sometimes for good reason, a lot of people not only seek to propagate their ideas within their own community, but within the broader U.S. community as a whole. And it's one thing when this issue comes down to something that is more of a minor policy debate, but when we have disagreements about what both sides see as fundamental issues of morality, such as racism or abortion or the fundamental human rights of immigrants, I think we can all say it's fair to see why people from both sides find it necessary to uphold these views in a larger scope and maybe even the entire country, as opposed to just allowing that one state can do it one way and another state can do it another way. And that's part of why I think that although French's idea sounds good in principle, I'm not sure that it could actually work in a practical application today. And we have to remember, for example, that the Federalist Papers, which he extols, were written 250 years ago in a world that was simply not as globally connected as the U.S. is today. So while in the late 18th century, it may have been sufficient for the Puritans to adopt rules in their colony based on their religious beliefs, and for the southern states to build an economy based on the institution of slavery, which already many people in the northern states were finding immoral, as soon as a century later in the Civil War, it became clear why on issues that are seen as fundamental moral issues, especially when combined with other economic and political incentives, are really quite hard to restrict to a simple issue of state rights. All that said, I do think that the points French raised are interesting, and I think that it's important, even if not in a strict state rights sort of sense or by secession even. I think that it's really important that we, across the political spectrum, think critically about how in America today we can enable more plurality. Not just a plurality of beliefs, but a plurality of cultures and of priorities, and to what extent this can be achieved in a way that allows differences versus to what extent we really do need to enforce certain laws on a nationwide level. In summary, I found this an interesting read, and it taught me a bit about the polarization in the United States, and I liked that it was written by a conservative viewpoint, which is one that I don't see represented as often in the kind of books that I've been reading. But it did fall short of what I was hoping for. It's far from the definitive source on any of the topics that are discussed inside, and in my opinion, he didn't even delve deeply enough into the topic of secession, given that it was featured in the book's title. I really wanted to know precisely what would or wouldn't enable secession, more than I cared about reading about some very specific secession scenarios that theoretically could arise. I gave the book a 3 out of 5 stars for what I learned from it, but I'm not sure I'd recommend it for most others. Instead, if you're interested in learning about this topic, especially the secession aspect, I'd recommend checking out Ezra Klein's podcast, which I'll link below. And then if one of the other aspects of this book that I talked about is interesting to you, I'd recommend finding a more definitive publication on that topic. Thanks for listening, and happy reading.